Good afternoon. My name is Brendan Jensen. I'm the chair of the Public Health and Safety Committee. In this capacity, we're functioning as a special committee in that we are reviewing a traffic safety ordinance. I especially want to thank our volunteer participants who have graciously agreed to join this committee when we met. Gosh, it's probably been nearly a year. Where we left off quite some time ago was we discussed the possibility of a traffic safety ordinance that would limit people's interaction with traffic on the road. The committee had worked through that process and then voted to move it forward, but fully knowing that it would not progress until a different committee that was working on a camping ordinance was able to complete their work. The original intent was that those two committees would combine and then complete the outcome of the combined work there, and instead the folks on the camping committee decided to continue the work there and move that forward. That's been completed, so it's now time for us to revisit how this ordinance essentially would plug into the work they had done there. So with that, we'll start over there with you, sir, and have you introduce yourself.
Aaron Jones with the Topeka Police Department.
I'm Brian Cole with the Shawnee County Department of Corrections.
Barry Feeker, Topeka Rescue Mission.
As I said, I'm Brendan Jensen.
Mike Padilla, District 5.
I'm Luther Gagne. I'm the legal advisor for the police department.
Thank you, sir. Mike Lesser called me moments before the meeting and said he was trapped at the doctor's office and would not be able to join us, so he sends his regret. So with that, I believe, Mr. Gagne, you have some comments on a slightly updated version of what we had looked at a number of months ago.
Yes, I do. The ordinance as was originally presented was based largely on different intersections and streets that I had looked at using police department information records. And I think we had several questions about the stats and what they meant. And the ordinance also used two different terminology. It designated certain streets as arterial that had the highest, from what I could identify at the time, the highest level of accidents involving pedestrians. And then we had another section that dealt with what we called a congested area, which was where there was a cluster of accidents. And again, that ordinance, as originally proposed, was based largely on internal police department records that I was looking at. What you have before you today is, went back to the drawing board, got some better information, and largely based this on, well, not largely, it is based on a document called the Metropolitan Transportation Safety Plan that is done by the Topeka Shawnee County Planning Association. They published this document, and this came out in August of 2019, and one of the things in that report is a section on distracted driving. And it identifies distracted driving as being a factor, as being a contributing factor in several of the top 10 causes of accidents at different intersections around Topeka. And then based on that information, it has a listing of 23 different intersections that have the highest number. So using that information, the ordinance was rewritten for your consideration today, removing any mention of arterial streets and removing the congested area box, and instead replacing it with just 23 intersections that mirrors the information contained in this transportation safety plan. Those 23 intersections are scattered. It's not in any one particular area of town. They're all over the city. They tend to be the busiest, and they also have very high rates of importance of an ordinance like this is we have to be very careful about any constitutionality of the amendment. And regarding that, there's a number of considerations that we have to be aware of. And the first one is, does the ordinance discriminate based on the content of the message being spoken by the, assuming we're talking about a pedestrian holding a sign, and the ordinance, if it discriminates based on what that sign says, then the court is going to apply what's called strict scrutiny to the ordinance. And almost always those ordinances are struck down as being unconstitutional. They begin review with a presumption that they are unconstitutional. They have to be narrowly tailored, and pretty much no other way to do this, and it has to involve a compelling government interest. So the idea in writing an ordinance like this is to avoid that level of scrutiny by the court. And the way you do that is by not discriminating based on the content of the message. So you want to write a law that is considered content neutral, where it doesn't matter what the person is saying. It applies equally to everybody. Under a content neutral analysis, the level of scrutiny the court would review that is significantly lower. It starts off with a presumption that it's not unconstitutional. The presumption is now that it is constitutional. And what the court is going to be looking at is that it's narrowly tailored and there's a significant government interest at stake. So with that framework, and the goal is we want an ordinance that is content neutral, so we don't have to risk strict scrutiny with a content-based ordinance. So writing an ordinance that is content neutral, the next thing we needed to do is to identify what is the government interest at stake. And that was a major reason for tying it to this transportation safety plan, dealing with distracted driving and mixing high volumes of vehicles with pedestrian activity, causing distractions. The government interest would be in preventing traffic crashes. And we of what intersections that we have the highest number of crashes. So that's what the ordinance is that you have before you today. The reworked version of it is based on that study, 23 intersections. And I guess my final comment would be just a word of caution. Having reviewed a number of Supreme Court cases on this, the latest one is a 2015 decision called Reed versus Town of Gilbert that involved a sign ordinance, basically. And they prohibited signs, but then they went on and made a whole bunch of exceptions where signs are bad except these categories of signs. And what the Supreme Court essentially said was, you're picking and choosing based on the content of what the message, what the sign says. So translating that over to what that means for this ordinance is kind of an all or nothing deal. If we're going to prohibit pedestrian activity at these intersections, it needs to be everybody. It doesn't matter whether it's panhandlers, charitable organizations, firefighters. Where ordinances run afoul of the Constitution is when they start making exceptions based on who the speaker is. And that's all I have.
So essentially, what is being proposed then is we would ban pedestrian interaction with vehicles in certain intersections where there's a higher risk of distracted driving based on traffic volumes or whatever the criteria are in that specific plan from the MPTO.
Yes. What the ordinance would do is it would ban any type of interaction between pedestrians and vehicles where they're attempting to solicit or exchange something with a vehicle. And it would permit, the only thing it would permit is for pedestrian to cross the street.
Sure.
To activate the traffic signal and simply cross the street.
So when we discussed this a number of months ago, and forgive me for not remembering the exact number, is the difference between that and what we have now essentially is just where or what classifies as the intersections, essentially, the areas where that interaction would not be permitted.
I think the difference is it's tied to, you have a better foundation for this ordinance to be based on, rather than just something that I put together based on police department records. You've actually got a document prepared and put out by a group that does this.
Okay.
And this is what they've said. So
Excellent.
when it comes to a potential court challenge, examining, well, what is our government interest, you've got a good foundation then to answer that question.
Excellent. Any questions?
Was there a pretty noticeable link between a pedestrian risk at these intersections, or these were just more prone to distracted accidents in the, is there a direct link there?
The plan itself, it devotes a whole chapter to distracted driving. And within distracted driving, it talks about the presence of work zones, the presence of school areas, and corridors with high pedestrian and bicycle activities. Those were the three main factors they looked at in identifying these intersections. Obviously, for purposes of this ordinance, we were looking at the pedestrian and bicycle activity is how we arrived at those 23 intersections.
Because there had been incidents related to bicycle or pedestrian at those intersections?
Yes.
Okay.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea here is to try and prevent accidents, to prevent incidents in the future, not necessarily, I mean, yes, it's important to have data to understand where we're coming from, but just because there hasn't been an incident at an intersection that is busy doesn't mean there can't be in the future. And so there shouldn't be a reason why we wouldn't want to try and make an intersection safer until, as opposed to waiting for some issue to happen and then come back and say, oh, well, now we need to make a change there.
Agree to that. However, from as many times this has been tried in courts in regards to it being challenged because of Constitution, just wanted to know if we're going to be any kind of a recommendation here that would set us up for a failure there.
Agreed, absolutely, yeah. And I appreciate the fact that this rewritten version has a much more firm foundation. So, other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you, and thank you, Luther. And I understood your presentation. I just want to be clear again. So it's at 23 designated locations where this would be, I guess, enforced or focused, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And
Go ahead, please.
And that's actually an important piece of this. And it's also important to any litigation reviewing this ordinance, is does it leave open ample opportunities, avenues of communication? And this is a very limited ordinance based on traffic crash data. It's limited to 23 intersections only, and any other intersection would be available for whatever type of activity pedestrians are engaging in. They could solicit, panhandle, any of those other intersections would be available.
Okay, good. And would we, as a city, continue to track that kind of activity to see if it's just shifted from one place to another place and we start to have more accidents in a different location that has not yet been identified through this report?
I believe so. This report, I'm not sure if it's done every year or every 2 years, but it's done regularly.
Okay.
This is not a one-time report.
And you use the term interaction. Now, is that interaction either by the driver or by a pedestrian? If either one initiates that interaction, I'm saying that maybe there's a pedestrian there, but they don't initiate, I guess, the interaction, but someone in a vehicle passing by decides they want to hand out something or give something to a pedestrian?
Yes, the ordinance is not just targeted at pedestrians. It
Okay.
applies to drivers as well. There is a section that prohibits drivers. No driver or operator shall park, stop, leave standing, suddenly decrease speed of a vehicle for purposes of responding to a person.
Now, I just want to make that clear because I just want to make, sure that people understand that there are a lot of people who are well-meaning and want to do something, but in doing so, they may be inadvertently violating that ordinance and making the danger level increase. And so, again, trying to avoid accidents or any possibility of accidents, it's upon the driving public just as well to not engage in an interaction that could cause harm to somebody.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
I was going to say, Luther, first, I commend you because on this work, because while I'm not an attorney, I have to write a lot of policy. And the governmental interest always comes up when I want to change something at the jail for something, or what is the Brian's or the governmental interest. I like the fact that it's fact-based, number one, or in my opinion. It's identifying problem areas. It's for prevention. It applies to everyone and things like that. Now, the only questions that I had was, are these, does this apply just to certain hours of the day, like time and place? Or like, is it from this hour to this hour? Is it just always on these deals? And kind of going to what Councilman Padilla had mentioned, what will constitute the interaction? I mean, let's say that I don't have, I am poor or indigent, and I'm just walking in a certain area between, I don't know what the areas are, I don't have but what happens if I'm not stationed in one place, but I just go from this corner and I walk to this corner, then I walk back to this corner and I walk. Now, I'm not trying to complicate or trying to say, okay, let's try to figure out every scenario that's out there, but I like what you've said. I commend you on that. But does this apply 24 hours a day, or is it specific high times during, whatever?
It is 24 hours a day.
Okay.
That piece of it is there's no time limit on it
Okay.
as far as that goes. It's just the intersections themselves. The other question is, the wording of the ordinance talks in one place about a pedestrian attempting to attract the attention of a driver. And obviously, there's going to be a certain amount of discretion,
Absolutely.
here with officers looking at this situation. But if a pedestrian is trying to attract the attention of a driver in order to, facilitate an exchange of something. Also, if they're, what it requires as a pedestrian, it permits them to cross the roadway, but it sets some limits to that. They can't stand there and repeatedly activate the crosswalk and not cross. They can use the crosswalk, they can activate the signal, but then the ordinance expects that they would go ahead and cross within 2 cycles of the signal.
Yeah, I again, and I appreciate that explanation. I appreciate it. I think it is the content neutral. I like that it applied to everyone and things like that. And I think goes back to what you had mentioned, sir, was trying to prevent. And I think sometimes in my business sometimes we don't see change till something big happens. And I'd much rather see something at the end. With me running the jail, obviously, I don't want to see the criminalization of those who are less fortunate. Mm-hmm. I don't want to see the city break the bank on housing people for these types of things. And I hope that in working with the courts, and I'm sure there will be, and I mean this with the utmost respect, that they'll be given a great amount of discretion of incarceration for any violations being the very last resort.
Sure.
I know we're the jail. I mean, we'll do our job and stuff like that, but I don't know what the fine structure. Really, I don't have an interest, meaning in where I work with that. That's none of my business. I just don't want to see somebody less fortunate just be criminalized. But Luther, I commend you. I truly do.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Gagne, but that the reason that it's not just a blanket ban is because we want people to have the opportunity to have those interactions if they choose. We just are asking them to choose intersections essentially that are not as dangerous as others.
Right. I guess the legal analysis of this is when it comes to things that could impact First Amendment protected speech, whether there are ample channels available to people to express that speech is an important factor that the court looks at. That's why we're not trying to ban this activity at every intersection in the city. It's protected speech, that's what the court has said, and we need to have places available for people to engage in that and not try to ban it everywhere. What we've done is identified kind of a time, place, and manner restriction where, based on traffic safety, we have the highest occurrences of distracted driving related crashes.
Excellent. Other comments?
Question.
Yes, sir.
Does this have a certain amount of feet away from that intersection that this is prohibited, or is it just at the intersection?
No, it's just at the intersection itself. So,
Just, I know that there are a number of times when somebody won't be necessarily at a intersection, but they'll be a few feet in front of it, depending on the way you're going to the intersection, attempting to get attention, either with a sign, and wouldn't necessarily be a transaction in the center of the intersection, but off to the side.
I think the designated intersection would probably be something that we would consider from like curb to curb, measured across the street. It also, though, talks about vehicles that are stopped at that intersection. So if you had somebody a little bit further down and traffic is backed up at that intersection, I think it would apply to that situation as well, because those vehicles are stopped at the intersection. So,
And that was going to be a question I had. You'll see that, and I didn't look, but you'll see people stopped at a left-hand turn, and people, either firefighters or whoever, that walk down a raised median all the way halfway down, and I have to assume that that would apply as well.
it would.
Yeah.
There is a section specifically for medians, that no person shall be upon the median of a designated roadway or a designated intersection.
Yeah.
So,
You had a comment, sir?
Along with Councilman Padilla's point, I think my question would be, how hard is it to interpret the report that you have in front of you into the intersections that you chose? So if in the future we need to change that, was that a long and drawn-out process, or was that something that's basically written in the report?
it's written in the report. The 23 intersections are all listed in the report itself. So it's literally cut and paste.
So I guess my question is, could we not just say whatever the report produces, that's what the ordinance would adopt?
Yeah, I suppose you could do it that way. I mean, we set them out and named them specifically in the ordinance, I think for clarity's sake, so we didn't have to refer to a document that I think most people probably wouldn't even have that document.
Right.
So listing them out in the ordinance by name seemed to be the more clear approach.
And then so I guess every year, or every time that's produced, we would need to reproduce and adopt the new ordinance?
Essentially, yes, we would have to amend the existing ordinance. There's goods and bads in that right now, because we have those in our ordinance and in addition to the report, that creates the double check process, and that has to come before the city council to review and approve and amend. So that keeps us engaged in this conversation and ensuring that this is the right thing for the community and doing what we need, as opposed to, I understand your point where, then it basically can just continue to go on its own. The issue I have with that is that eliminates basically the automatic oversight part of it. If it has to come back before the council every couple of years to be amended or reviewed, then with something especially as sensitive as traffic safety, I think that's actually a good thing. The downside, obviously, is that when changes are made in one thing, there's a certain period of time where it needs to work through the council process to get updated. But at the same time, unless the community drastically changes overnight, I don't foresee, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't foresee these changing that often. And I, for one, would like it to come back through the council for review.
I would agree.
A lot of it is based on the report, the transportation safety plan, and it looks at things like the design of the intersection and the traffic flow through that intersection. There will be some changes to that over time, but it will largely be pretty consistent.
Other comments? Yes, sir.
If I may, I would agree with you, Councilman Jensen. If it's going to be reviewed on a regular basis by the council, I think that shows the importance of what we're trying to do. It gives it that specific attention and not a rubber stamp, because a lot of things go into place, and then if it's not revisited, it just kind of fades off to the background, which leads me to another question. If this does pass in its current form, what, if any, plans do we have to inform the public? Because I don't know how many times you hear this, and certainly my fellow colleague, police officer, I didn't know it was against the law. Nobody told me. And what can we do as much as possible for the entire community to understand what we're trying to do and where it's effective? I know that they won't be able to remember all the 23 designated intersections. So it's just a thought, how do we get that information to them, and so that it's not just put out once or twice and then we forget? Is there a way that we can maybe suggest or think of to make sure that that we avoid unnecessary interactions between pedestrians and traffic and law enforcement with anybody who violates the ordinance because they just didn't know?
Right. One way I've seen, and I think this is one way to go about doing it, is posting signs at those specific intersections, saying that they are restricted. Community that I've looked at further, and not only post that sign that it's not allowed there, but then they have an additional sign that if people want to give charitable contributions or something, that they give a phone number or an organization where those can be done. An alternative is provided.
Yeah.
But I think posting signs at the intersections that are restricted would be effective.
I've read an article on just that, where it encourages by notice to the drivers that this is not to be done at this intersection. But for those people who need to get assistance, it gives them a phone number to call or something, so that they can go to another place or get assistance at a different location, so that it's a constant reminder to both the pedestrians and the traffic.
Yes, sir.
The last thing I was going to say, this isn't obviously it's a living, breathing document that would come back before the council, and I agree with all that. But the intent of this isn't to, when we put these prevention things in place, obviously our desire is that they're going to become safer and traffic's going to, but that doesn't go with the idea that, okay, well now that, and I'm just going to throw it, 21st and Wanamaker safe, now we're going to take it off the list. And 21st and Walnut is a high risk, so we're going to take this one off and we're going to add this one on. And I hope we don't make that mistake, because I mean, like when we put something in place at the jail and it reduces, like the introduction of contraband, and we see the reduction of contraband come in, it's like, okay, we don't see it anymore, so we don't need to stop. We don't need to do that anymore. We don't need to do pat downs anymore. So my question would be is that the intent obviously is to reduce stuff, but it's not to take intersections off to have them later become potentially dangerous. But you'd mentioned something, Luther, about there has to be avenues for those to be able to, if we keep adding, if people go to other areas, is the expectation, I hope not, but that the accidents don't go up in some other areas, and we keep adding, and then the argument comes, well, in 5 years, you're going to have, everybody keeps moving to these other places. They can't be here this year. Now they can't be here and here. Now they can't be here, here, and here. That then there's no place for anybody to speak their constitutionality. I don't know if I've made that too complicated.
I think in subsequent reviews of this, it
Yeah.
would be important to involve some of the people that are responsible for putting this document together, that do the study and are familiar with these numbers. And one of the main questions that we would want to ask is, why has the number decreased for that? Why is this intersection no longer on the list? It may be something to do with the intersection's been redesigned, or
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
traffic's been rerouted or something. In that situation, it would be okay to drop the intersection from the list. So the reason why for the decrease would be an important thing to consider.
Oh, I agree 100%.
As far as people moving around and adding intersections, this is based on number of pedestrians, but it's also considering the flow of the traffic, the volume of the traffic. And if you have, a couple of more accidents at a smaller intersection, that may not be significant enough to make the list, because it is considering the volume of traffic through the intersection.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree.
Excellent. Unless there were any objections, I thought I would offer anybody in the audience the chance to speak if they would like. 4 minutes at the podium. Sir?
Dr. Russell Burton, thank you for the time to speak. I got to say, was the current ordinance online? Because I was looking for it, and all I could find was the outdated one, which is, by the way, Luther, this is an amazing piece of writing. I think you've done a great job and a great piece of logic. Is this one online available, or?
I don't know, Liz, would you have any idea? No. Okay, yeah, so it,
Hasn't been made yet, but it.
Okay, because that was a problem at the subcommittee meeting for the camping ordinance. The most recent
I see.
ordinance wasn't online.
I'll email you a copy of it. I have your address.
Oh, okay, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Oh, okay. Okay, that'd be
Okay,
fine.
thank you, that's fine. Why did they stop at 23 intersections, Luther, if I may, instead of 24 or 25? Was there a logic at why the cutoff magical number was 23?
What I can tell you is the transportation safety plan in the chapter dealing with distracted driving provides a list of intersections in the city and Shawnee County area that rank high across all emphasis areas for intersection, speed, distracted driving, pedestrian and bicyclists. And there were actually 27 intersections on that list, and only 23 of them are within the city limits.
Okay, I see.
So I'm not sure what the threshold was for the organization writing this on what they consider to be high.
Okay,
So I simply based it off their list.
okay, all right, thank you. So, and then, again, I wanted to say the content neutral law thing, I think that's fantastic. You know, I think you've done a real good job. It's taken my concerns about a lot of how it's going to impact the homeless population. It's taken a lot of my concerns away about that.
Excellent.
I like the idea of an alternative sign that says, if you want to donate, here it is. And I would suggest there's a new nonprofit in town that practice housing first, second chance.
Shameless
Street
plug.
Coalition. If you wanted to put one on there, I'd appreciate that. Let's see. And to the idea of delta of change, I mean, if this law works, you should see change at the intersection. They should decrease, and then new ones will come up. But if you spend a lot of good work tying the law to that report, and then some of what was suggested here might untie that report. If you start putting intersections on there, leaving intersections on there that aren't on that report, then you've kind of untied that report to the logic of the law in some ways, right?
I think it would be important going forward to keep this ordinance tied to that report, because that is a report that's based on distracted driving and why we're having crashes where we're having them.
Right. Outstanding logic. Thank you guys very much. I appreciate the time. I had a whole bunch of stuff about the homeless, but I don't need to do that. So thank you guys very much.
Thank you so much. Other comments or questions? Excellent.
Thanks.
Well, with that, I would entertain a motion to approve the ordinance as submitted. And then from there, if this is approved, it would then go on to the full council for approval. And then, so if it gets approved, what's the lead time for implementation?
Publication?
Okay, so in theory, it would go into effect sometime early next year, essentially? Okay, all right, excellent. Yes, sir?
Signage, would the signage go up, obviously, before the law would go into effect?
Okay. That's something we could discuss. I mean, it's certainly possible to time that, depending on how long it takes signs to get put together. I'll do some research on that and get back with you. So I'm not necessarily opposed to that, no, I would say. So other comments, questions?
So move with the motion.
I have a
Second.
motion and a second. Motion and a second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. I do not believe that we need to set a future meeting date, having once again completed our work. So unless there are any other comments, I would accept a motion to adjourn.
So move.
All right, motion and second. We are adjourned.
Good work, Luther.